We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Dalet and Beis in Mesechet Yevamos. This is Yevamos Daf 94b. The Mishnah here continues low, means to say that his wife is permitted to him. Again, the case over here was they tell a man that his wife had died and so he marries her sister. Then it turns out that his wife is alive, so that marriage to the sister is considered nothing, and so his original wife is allowed to return to him. And the Mishnah continues, mutter bekrovo shniya. Now he's mutter in the relatives of the second one, meaning in the relatives of the sister that he had thought he married. It turned out he had not married her. So he's mutter to her relatives because they were never married. Ushniya mutaris bekrovav, and similarly that second wife of his, again the sister, she's mutter to his relatives for the same reason. They were never actually married. Via Mesa Rishona, mutter b'shniya. Now, if his first wife would actually die, he's mutter with the second wife, even though he had thought that he had already married the second wife, and that turned out to be znus. But now he's allowed to actually marry the second wife now that his first wife had died. And the Mishnah continues, Amru lo, if they say to him at Mesa Ishto, they tell him that his wife has died, V'noasas achosa, so he marries her sister. V'achar kach amru lo, and then they say to him Kayemis, that she's actually alive. Kayemis haisav a Mesa, rather she was alive and then she died. In other words, when we told you she had died, she had not yet died, but now she did die. So then the halach is Havlad Rishon Mamzer v'Achron Eno Mamzer. The first child that he has with his sister, that child is a Mamzer because that child he had while his wife was actually still alive. So that's a situation where it was with his sister while his wife was alive. So the child's a Mamzer. But the second child he has, let's say he has a child after the wife actually died, so then he's married to the sister and that's fine because the other woman, the other sister is not alive anymore. So that second child is not a Mamzer. Rabbi Yossi says, Kol sheposel al yedei acherim, anyone who disqualifies others, posel al yedei atzmo, disqualifies himself. V'chol she'ein posel al yedei acherim, eino posel al yedei atzmo. Anyone who doesn't disqualify others does not disqualify himself, and that line is going to be explained in the Gemara. Rashi over here says, Umutter b'krovos hashniya li sabita. So for example, again, he's allowed to marry, let's say, the daughter of that second wife, because it wasn't really, they were never really married. The Kaimalan, as we've established, Nosan al Hanusa Alamafuta, you're allowed to marry, talking about here the relatives. Let's say you have a situation of rape, a situation of seduction. Again, this is a situation where it's not really, he was never really married to her, and it was just znus. So therefore, at this point in time, he's going to be mutter to her relatives. And the Gemara says, V'afagav dozel ishto v'giso l'medinas hayam. This case over here in our Mishnah, again, we're talking about the situation where his wife went on a trip to Medinas Hayam and he thought that his wife had died, so he married his wife's sister. So the Gemara is now saying, even if his wife went together with his brother-in-law, meaning this very same sister, her husband, also went on the trip with his wife, Lemedinas Hayam. De'ahani nisuim de kamitzra eshes giso agiso. So now what happens is that he hears that not only did his wife die, he also thinks his brother-in-law died. So he now thinks he can marry his wife's sister because number one, his wife has died, so it's not a problem of marrying two sisters. And number two, the husband of this sister also has died on the trip, so therefore she's not a married woman anymore. So he figures he can marry the sister. But the problem is that this nisuim, this marriage to the sister, actually works. The marriage that he has to the sister actually now prohibits the wife of his brother-in-law to the brother-in-law. If that man turns out to still be alive, he will not be able to marry his wife anymore, that sister, because now she's committed adultery. She's been with another man while she was really married. Nevertheless, Esha Zigiso Asira Ishto Sharia. The wife of his brother-in-law becomes usher to her husband, but his own wife is permitted to him, because again, when he married his wife's sister, that was not a marriage at all, and therefore he's allowed to go, his wife is allowed to return to him. Rashi over here says, Vigiso Bal Achos Ishto. It means again, the husband of the sister of his wife. Uba Eirechod V'Yomarlo, and one aid comes and says, Mesa Ishtecha, Vilazu Amar Meis Balich. The aid says, your wife died, and then he tells this one that your husband died, meaning he tells the sister. V'Yamar V'Nasa, so now he goes ahead and he marries the sister. V'Achar Kachbo Ishto V'Giso, now his wife and his brother-in-law, they both come back. So now we have an issue over here, and the point is that the sister becomes prohibited to her husband, but his wife is still permitted to him. That's going to be the distinction. And the Gemara continues, V'lo Amrinan, and we do not say the following logic. We don't say, Mitoch Shenesra Eshes Giso Agiso. Since this relationship caused that the wife of his brother-in-law is usher to his brother-in-law, so Teyasar Ishto Olav, we should say that in the same way, his wife should be prohibited to him. We don't say that mitoch, and again, we say his wife is permitted to him, even though the sister is going to be prohibited to his brother-in-law. And the Gemara continues, Lema masnisin delo Rebbe Akiva. Let us say that our Mishnah is not like Rebbe Akiva. Rashi over here says, Lema masnisin dekatani muteres lachzor. Our Mishnah says that again, if he's with the sister, then it turns out that his wife is alive, he's allowed to stay married, his wife can return to him. That does not seem to be like Rebbe Akiva. And the Gemara explains, the Rebbe Akiva, because if it followed Rebbe Akiva, Havela achos gerushaso, this actually would be the sister of his grusha, because as we're about to see, Rebbe Akiva holds he actually would have to divorce the sister. Rashi over here says, Delo Rebbe Akiva, the Rebbe Akiva, Kevan deboy hachagita minei. There's going to be a halacha that this sister is going to require a get from him. So Havale ishto achos grusha, so it becomes that his wife is actually the sister of his grusha, and that's actually a problem. Achos grushaso should be a problem. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, Kol arayos shebetorah, all situations of arayos that are in the Torah, let's say a brother marries a sister or something like that, ein tzrichos heimenu get. Those relationships, those marriages are nothing, and no get is required. Chutz me'eshes ish shenisas al pi bezdin. Except, let's say you have a situation where a married woman gets permission from bezdin to marry somebody else because they believe that the husband has died. It turns out the husband's alive. So in such a situation, a get is going to be required. Rashi over here says, Chutz me'eshes ish shenisas al pi bezdin mishum gezeira. That's just because of a gezeira decree. Shemayomru giresh zev v'chulu kedamin le'el beperkin. Because people might believe that there was a divorce over here and that this was a real marriage, and so therefore we require a get in this particular situation. Again, that's just a gezeira. For Rabbi Akiva Moshe, but Rabbi Akiva adds on the following cases: Af eshes ach v'achos isha. Also, let's say you have a situation where a person marries his brother's wife, or let's say you have a situation where a person marries the sister of his wife. In those situations as well, those are cases of arayos, but they also require a get. Rashi says, Rabbi Akiva Moshe, v'hashta sal kadaitach. Now, what we think it means is as follows right now: Afilu nesuas achiv v'shama shemeis v'yivma. Let's say you have a situation where a woman was married to his brother, and he hears that the brother dies, and so therefore he does yibum. Uba achiv, and now the brother comes by get. So now we think it means that a get is required in that case. V'chein b'achos isha, and the same thing is true by achos isha. V'tayim, and the reason v'tayim lo yadinan dehachalek l'meimar girsha zeh v'nasa zeh. Now the reason we don't know, because here you can't say that people are going to think it's like a gezeira. People are going to think that there was a divorce and then a marriage. Shafilu girsha bala, because even if you had a situation where his brother divorced his wife, ein kiddushin shel zeh tovsin, but you're not able to marry the wife of your brother just because they got a divorce. So the reason here is not 100% clear, but the point over here is at this point in time we think that that is the case. The case is where he thought his brother had died, he thought there's a situation of yibum, turns out his brother's alive, and a get is required. V'chein legabe achos isha, the same thing is going to be true. Let's say by achos isha you have a situation where he married his wife's sister. Me'achar shabasa ishto, now once his wife comes back, golei lakal shein kiddushay shniya kiddushin, it would seem to be obvious to everybody that the kiddushin he had with that other woman, meaning the sister, is not going to be a kiddushin because his wife was alive. It sounds like nevertheless Rabbi Akiva has a fine over here and says that a get is required. And so the Gemara now says, "V'keivan d'amar Rabbi Akiva boy get." Now, since Rabbi Akiva says a get is required by achos isha, which we think is exactly our case. Again, the person believes his wife has died. He marries the sister of his wife. Turns out his wife is actually alive, so now a get is required. Memela itzur aleh. So memela there should be an itzur to have a lo achos grusha. So because you have a situation here now where his wife is the sister of his grusha, and that should be a problem. But the Gemara continues, V'lavitmar Allah, but wasn't it said on this case, this brisa here that we're talking about Rabbi Akiva Shita, that was already explained in the following fashion. Amar Rav Gidol, Amar Rav Chia bar Yosef, Amar Rav. Rav Gidol said in the name of Rav Chia bar Yosef, in the name of Rav, Hay'eshes ach echidami. This case of Eshes ach over here, where we're saying that a get is required, what's the case? Kegon shekidesh achiv es ha'isha. The case is, let's say his brother had kiddushin with this woman. V'halach le'medinas hayam, he went to Medinas Hayam. V'shama shemeis achiv, and he heard that the brother had died. V'yamad v'nosas ishto, so he went ahead and he married his wife. So in this case, the point over here is that it's a case of kiddushin. So why is the get required if it turns out the brother is actually alive? Because people will say, people might think that there was actually a condition in that original condition of the brother, and therefore maybe that condition didn't really actually take effect. So people will think, and people will think this actually was a good marriage when he married this woman. It was a good marriage because the original kiddushin that they had, the brother and the wife, maybe wasn't a good kiddushin, and that's why we require a get, because people will get confused and they might actually believe that a get is required. And the same thing, you can come up with a case by achos isha. isha hechi dami. What's the case? Kegon shekidesh es isha. Let's say a person had kedushin with a woman. V'halcha lemedinas hayam, and then she went to Medinas Hayam. V'shama shameis, and he hears that this woman died. Amad v'nasas achos, and he gets up and he marries her sister. So in this case also, the Amriyanshi people will say, even if it turns out the wife was alive, but people will say, hachamaisa tanai havale b'kedusha. This first wife, there was a condition in her kedushin. The kedushin wasn't really fulfilled, and therefore there was no kedushin, and maybe the wife, the marriage rather to the sister was good, and that's why Rabbi Akiva requires a get. V'shapir nasav, and this was a good marriage again to the sister. That's why a get is required. Now that only works in situations of kedushin, because people might think a kedushin is on a tanai. But ela nisuin mi'ikol ameimar tanah havale b'nisuin. But if you're talking about a situation of an actual marriage, where it's not just that he had a kedushin with the woman, but he was actually married to the woman, is there ever a case of a tanai and nisuin? Generally speaking, there's no tanai and nisuin, and therefore there's nothing for people to get confused with. So on the contrary, a get will not be required. Like in our Mishnah, for example, in our Mishnah, a get is not going to be required to the sister, even according to Rabbi Akiva, and that's why he can go back to his original wife. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Ashi le Rav Kahana. Rav Ashi said to Rav Kahana, I Rabbi Akiva. If we are now saying that our Mishnah could be Rabbi Akiva, so listening nami chamosa, you actually could have another case in the Mishnah. You could have a case where he marries his mother-in-law after he thinks his wife dies. To Hashamina leil Rabbi Akiva, because we've heard according to Rabbi Akiva, the Amar chamosa la'achar misa la b'sreifa, that if a person marries his mother-in-law after the death of his wife, that's not in a situation of sreifa. As Rashi over here says, I Rabbi Akiva imasnis Rabbi Akiva. If you're saying that the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva to come hafchis leukmei nami Rabbi Akiva, meaning you're saying that our Mishnah could also follow Rabbi Akiva. So listening chamosa. So in that case, you could have chamosa in the Mishnah. Amru lo mesa ishtacha. The case could be as follows: they tell him that your wife died. V'nasa im, and he goes and he marries her mother. To Rabbi Akiva chamosa lachar misas ishto sharia, because it happens to be according to Rabbi Akiva, his mother-in-law after his wife died is actually permitted. It would basically be identical to the case of the sister. So the point is, if you're saying that the Mishnah could be Rabbi Akiva, you might as well have said that we're talking about a case of chamoso again, because after the wife died, he can marry her. The Tani, as we learned in a brayso, bo'esh yisrfu oso veshen. It says that they're going to have a punishment of sreifa. Oso v'yas achas mehen divrei Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yishmael says it's him and one of them. Rabbi Akiva says oso v'yas shtehen. It means to say him and both of them. And Rashi over here explains v'yas achas mehen. So the pasuk here is talking about a situation of a person who marries a woman and let's say her mother-in-law, and so it says they both get sreifa. Now that doesn't make sense. The first woman that he married, that was a perfectly legitimate marriage, so why should they both get sreifa? So the first opinion is, Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, it means achas mehen. As Rashi says, shekein b'lashon Yevani, like in Greek, korin la'achas heina. The word achas is called heina. So when it says oso v'yas hen, it really just means one of them gets sreifa. V'yamar rachmana achrona shenasa be'isr tisarif. And the Torah is just saying the one you married last, meaning the one you married be'isr, that's the one that has to get the punishment of sreifa. Let's say you married a woman and then you married her mother-in-law, so the mother-in-law is the one that's going to get sreifa, not the woman who you married. That was already permitted, that original marriage. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says oso v'yas shtehen. It means he gets sreifa and both of them get sreifa. Now how do we understand Rabbi Akiva? That's going to be the question. So Rashi over here first says oso v'yas shtehen kidikava'inon hasam b'Sanhedrin. This is all explained in Sanhedrin. Mai beinayu. What's the difference between them? Havada yishto gemura lo amar Rabbi Akiva de b'sreifa. Certainly his actual wife that he married first, she's not going to get sreifa. Sharei aniyazu machata. What sin did she do? Harei beheter nisislo. He married her beheter. The only thing is going to be a subsequent woman who was a relative. That's the issue. That person's going to get sreifa. So what's Rabbi Akiva saying? V'yamar Abaye. So Abaye says mashmo is dor shanika beinayu. So Abaye says they're really not arguing. Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva aren't really arguing in terms of halacha. They're arguing in terms of how you understand the psukim. The Rabbi Akiva savar tarti ksivi chamoso ve'im chamoso. Rabbi Akiva says, well, we're talking about two women here. Let's say he married his mother-in-law and he also married the mother of his mother-in-law. Nafki mehaikra de v'sreifa. That's talking about the sreifa of both of them. The way you read the pasuk according to that is as follows: Ish kigach es isha v'ima ushtehen le'iser. A woman rather, and her mother both le'iser. Kegon shenasa chamoso ve'im chamoso. In other words, a person marries his mother-in-law and the mother of his mother-in-law. That's the two women we're talking about in the pasuk. Obviously, his first wife, that's permitted, but he married two other women that were a problem: his mother-in-law and the mother of his mother-in-law. But eish yisrafu, so then they get the punishment of sreifa. Rabbi Yishmael savar chadaksiv, and Rabbi Yishmael says, no, you have to read the pasuk. It's talking about one individual. Chamosa lechudash. Meaning it's talking about his mother-in-law that gets sreifa. The Isha is his first wife. Hanisas beheter, that was a marriage beheter. And the word ima refers to his mother-in-law. So that's what ashen means. It means one of them, it means he gets sreifa, and then the mother-in-law. And according to that understanding, the mother of the mother-in-law is learned out from somewhere else, from a Gzera Shava. Now that's the opinion, again, that's the opinion of Abaya, that they're just arguing in how to understand the pasuk. But Rava says no, there's really an actual argument in halacha between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. The difference is a case of a mother-in-law after the death of his wife. Rabbi Yishmael b'sreifa. According to Rabbi Yishmael, so the mother-in-law still gets sreifa. It means one of them, meaning even if they're not both alive, even if his wife died, the mother-in-law still gets sreifa. For example, if his wife died and he married her mother, she gets sreifa. Rabbi Akiva savar osovias shtein, it means both of them, meaning bisman shestein kayamos, they have to both be alive. Ishto v'chamoso, meaning his wife and his mother-in-law have to be alive. Yisrafu also. So then you have that situation. In other words, what Rabbi Akiva is saying is once his wife dies, there's no prohibition on the mother-in-law. Umistama kedino kain din chamoso tehishvakosav ishal ish. Now it means Yisrafu. So he gets sreifa, but the same would be true by the mother-in-law. Again, there's no prohibition to the mother-in-law if the wife has died. L'chalon shetabatora umasnisin delokatani chamoso hanicha le'abaya damar mashmos darshanika beinayu. This is what the Gemara is about to say. Now, if our Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva, so according to Abaya, it's fine, because Abaya never says this idea that a mother-in-law is permitted when the wife dies. Rabbi Akiva nafkaleim chamosa mehaikro. Rabbi Shmuel lo nafkaleim mehacha v'lo ayri Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva v'chamosa la'achamisa klal. Again, according to Abaya, they're not talking. There is no machlokas Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva by chamosa la'achamisa. Shaper, that's fine. Ela l'Rava lisnia, but the Gemara's question is only going to be according to Rava. According to Rava, who says within Rabbi Akiva that the mother-in-law is permitted after the death of the wife, so the mother-in-law could have been a case in the Mishnah. Again, according to Abaya, that's not true. There was no difference between a mother-in-law before or after the death of the wife. According to Abaya, they're just arguing how to understand the psukim. And anyways, the Gemara is going to answer, granted that there's no sreifa by the mother-in-law after Misa, and we'll see the answer in just a moment. And so the Gemara now continues, I understand, according to Abaya, as Rashi just said, the Amar Mashmos Dorshanika Benayu says that the only machlokas Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva is just how you understand the psukim. So then fine. Rabbi Yishmael savar chodak siv, Rabbi Akiva savar tartik siv. Rabbi Yishmael holds we're talking about one woman. Rabbi Akiva says the pasuk is talking about two women. So then shaper, so then it's fine. There is no issue about a mother-in-law being permitted after the death of the person's wife. But according to Rava, who says that there is a machlokas here in halacha between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, and the difference is a mother-in-law after the death of his wife, that's the nafkamina. So then, listening nami chamoso. So then in the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Akiva, if we just said the Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva, so then mother-in-law should be in the Mishnah. The case should be a person hears his wife dies, and so then he goes and he marries his mother-in-law, and then it turns out that his wife is actually alive. And so the Gemara says, Amar Lei, so he said back to him, Nihi demiyata krami sreifa. No, granted, even according to this position of Rava, so the pasuk is saying there's no punishment of sreifa in a situation when a person is with his mother-in-law after his wife dies. But meisura mimiyata kra, but it does the pasuk say there's no prohibition whatsoever. There's still going to be a prohibition, so you cannot have this case in the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues, so why doesn't his wife become prohibited to him just from the fact that he lied with his wife's sister? In other words, even if he was with his wife's sister and it wasn't a legitimate marriage, shouldn't that be enough to make his wife prohibited to him? As Rashi over here says, just the fact that he was together with the sister of his wife, why isn't that enough to prohibit the wife to him? And the Gemara says it should be similar to a situation where you have a woman whose husband goes Lamedinas Hayam, as Rashi over here says, Midi dehave aisha shalach bala lemedinas hayam de mitzra lebala b'shchivas ha'achron. If she's together with another man, suddenly she becomes usher to the husband. Ve'ava b'shisho geges, even though it's a mistake. Ve'amai katani masisim muteres lachzer lo. So why is it that wife can return in our case? How come when a woman's husband goes lemedinas hayam and she's with another man by mistake, thinking her husband died, she becomes prohibited to her husband? But over here, where the man is together with her sister and the wife is in lemedinas hayam and it turns out she's alive, so in that situation, we say he's not prohibited to his wife. And so the Gemara answers, Lo domi ishto devemezid asira mido raisa b'shoge gazru barabanan. It's not comparable, because by the case of his wife, in that situation, if it would happen b'mezid, meaning if this woman would commit adultery, be with another man b'mezid when she was a married woman, so there would be an isser on a do raisa level. So if it happens b'shogeg, so then the Rabbanan say, even though it just happened b'shogeg, we make a gezerah midrabbanan, and they have to separate. It's Rashi over here says, Umeshaninan lo dami isha shahalach devemezid mitzra midoraisa. If she would commit adultery b'mezid, she's also doraisa. T'chsiv ilo nespasa demashma isura hilkach b'shogeg kagon al pi bezin gazer barabbanan. Again, it says, it means to say over there, if it's v'hilo nespasa, if it's a situation where it was against her will, fine. But if she did it willingly, she committed adultery willingly, the halacha really is she's prohibited to the husband. So therefore, b'shogeg, so in such a situation, they're going to make a gezerah and they're going to say it's prohibited. Masha Einkein, that is not the case by the prohibition of achos ishto, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Hey Amud Aleph.